Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to today's GHG Coordination Working Group. My name is Christina Guimero, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. Today's slide deck presentation is available on the initiative webpage. You can get to that page by going to kaiso.com, and then under the Stakeholder Center tab on the homepage, you'll see Policy Initiatives. If you click that link, it'll take you to our main initiative landing page where you can search for the initiative webpage. This meeting is being recorded, and the video file will be posted to the initiative webpage for information and convenience purposes only. The recordings and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. If you need any technical assistance at any point during the meeting, please send a chat to Inteller Events, the host. To ask questions during the meeting, you can open the participant and chat panels on the bottom right. You can then raise your hand by selecting the raise hand icon, or if you joined audio only, please press *3 on your device. For everyone joining us today, please state your name and affiliation first before speaking, and you may also send comments and questions via chat to all participants, to all panelists. And just a reminder that commissioners and advisors from state public utility commissions may be in attendance today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Isabella to get us started.
All right, thanks, Christina. Hey, everyone. My name is Isabella Nicosia. I am the facilitator for the GHG Coordination Working Group, and I'm also an account manager here at the ISO on the stakeholder engagement team. So for today's agenda, we're going to kick things off with a discussion from Anya and Sylvie on the accounting and reporting approach, and kind of walk through a scorecard. So it'll be an attribute, scorecards, and residual rate options that we'll walk through. And then we'll take a little bit of a break and come back later on to hear from George Angelides on counterfactual options. And then we'll leave some time at the end today to go over next steps and cover the working group schedule for the rest of the year, and then our next working group for 2025. So this graphic here just shows where we are currently at in the working group process. So we are here at assessment and resolution. And with that, I will turn things over to Sylvie and Anya, and we'll dive into our first topic today. And Sylvie, I believe you are muted.
Rookie mistake. Thanks, Isabella. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining the GHG working group this afternoon. We're going to be, as Isabella noted, Anya and I will be walking you through some scorecards relating to the accounting and reporting approaches and the discrete design choices that we were discussing in last week's working group. As a reminder, this LSC level accounting and reporting approach has really been supported by a majority of stakeholders and comments. But the most common piece of feedback that we've gotten so far from stakeholders is that more discussion would be helpful to clarify some of these discrete design choices, to understand what trade-offs are associated with each of these approaches. So in today's meeting, we're going to focus both on refining the LSC level accounting and reporting approach, as well as an interim approach or interim no-cost approaches that might support greater accuracy of a residual emissions rate. And we'll talk about the different attributes of these various approaches, what the potential trade-offs might be, what the costs and impacts might be, and the timeline for development. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the things that our team discovered as we were trying to sort of benchmark the implementation list and the timeline for each of these approaches is that it may not be a simple exercise of, one design choice increasing costs across the board, but rather the trade-offs associated with each of these decision points really depends on the context. So I'll walk you through the solution scorecard and some of the discrete design choices that we had stakeholders comment on in the last round of comments. And then a couple of initial or example scorecards that are intended as a first pass to really highlight areas where we think more information might be helpful to underscore some of the costs involved, or where more discussion might be helpful to better assess and solidify the trade-offs associated with these different approaches. So I've created this rough key of red, yellow, green to highlight what the lift might look like for each of these approaches. In the red category, the general theme of what we might find there is trade-offs between feasibility and the outcome that's intended by policy, or long development times and high-cost projects. And so in each of these, for each of these solution characterizations, we're going to talk about stakeholder feedback, impacts the ISO, impacts the market participant, and what we might need to do in the working group to further coordinate these approaches. So under the red dot, stakeholder feedback in this category might include a lack of support, or we've heard stakeholders say that this approach or this choice might impose costs in terms of policy or otherwise. Impacts the ISO might include tariff changes or new systems or modifications to core systems that would be costly or time intensive, or aspects of these approaches might conflict with processes that we currently have with regulators. The market participant impacts that we've identified might be that it would require new business practices or impose a financial cost, and some working group coordination efforts would be required. And in the red category, I put requires stakeholder consensus, which I know might be a difficult task given the diversity of policies and opinions and objectives out there. Or decisions might conflict with principles of the working groups that we established earlier this year. In the yellow category, it's not as big of a lift. Things in this category require incremental changes and may be feasible in the medium term. Things in this category stakeholders may have expressed interest in or requested further discussion, so not a red or a green in either direction. In terms of ISO impacts, we might see data privacy issues or confidentiality, but those require workarounds but aren't necessarily a signal that something might be infeasible. From a technology perspective, we might require new calculations, new processes to validate data, but those are all things that we are capable of doing today. Impacts to the market participant might require incremental engagement or administrative costs. And in the working group, things in this category might require some alignment and additional discussion, or the ISO would need more information from you, but definitely not a showstopper. And then what we're really looking for is green, low-hanging fruit, things that are feasible in the near term. So these might be things that stakeholders support broadly or have a demonstrated regulatory requirement for. In terms of the ISO impact, there might be an existing business practice, or we haven't identified any liability concerns that would require the need for any workarounds or tariff changes. Impacts to the market participant, no change from today, and we don't see any need for further coordination. And I'll just again note that this is really intended as an initial pass to highlight areas where we need to talk more about what's involved here, but definitely not intended to make a decision right now about what's feasible and what's possible. So let's go to the next slide. In the next two slides after this, I'll break this down a little bit further, but at a high level, this is one of the first questions that we tossed to stakeholders last time and requested feedback on, which is, at what geographic area should we produce these reports? The two options that were originally discussed are BA level and LSC level, and in last month's discussion, we also started to talk about climate region or other sort of policy related level. And I'll walk you through this, and I'd really like and we've got some questions embodied in this slide. And what we're looking for is guidance to help us characterize within the scope of the solution scorecard how easy or hard or what the trade-offs are associated with each of these different options. So under BAA level, what we heard from stakeholders is that some stakeholders support BAA level reporting as an overview of market GHG impacts, but this would really be in addition to more granular reporting. So BAA level alone wouldn't be sufficient to meet the working group's goals. The impact to CAISO, this is really a baseline. So anything different from a BA level will have more impact to CAISO, either technology or business practices. So BA level reporting would require some aggregation in order to maintain data privacy. Coming up with a residual rate based on BAA would require new validation and calculation, but overall this is incremental to what we do today because the ISO already does things at a BA level in other aspects of market operations. In terms of the market participant impact, the ISO BAA coordination already exists today. So we didn't see a need for further action with respect to the market participant impact. But we do have questions for the working group when it comes to BAA level reporting. While for the most part, this seems incremental and a low lift, we're wondering how multi-jurisdictional entities might want to be modeled if we do provide something like this as an incremental or near-term solution before moving on to an LSC level approach. So maybe I'll stop there, and I'd welcome feedback. Actually, I'd welcome feedback on the solution scorecards that we saw on the previous slide, but also with respect to BA level approach. Any reactions to this or any comments on multi-jurisdictional entities?
I'm not currently seeing any hands raised or any questions coming in, Sylvie.
Maybe I'll add in, we've heard feedback of, what would it mean for my entity, or how would you model X, Y, Z? And I think this is an area where we would like to hear from you in terms of if you're a multi-jurisdictional entity or span multiple states, what type of modeling works best for you, and give us a little bit more information about that. And if it's kind of too soon to bring up on this call, maybe something to include in your comments or in a separate conversation with the CAISO on what ideal modeling best reflects your unique circumstance as it relates to GHG reporting.
I'm not currently seeing any hands raised at this moment.
Looks like we may have just gotten a hand from Stuart Kelly. Can we unmute Stuart's line?
Hey, Anya, I would, just in listening into some of the EDAM calls, specifically around tariffs and different things for the entities, I am seeing, and even seeing in comments, a big push from LSCs for, things like settlement LSC level, and, other things to be done at the LSC level. So I would note there seems to be an appetite for that, but it maybe be better to hear from the LSCs themselves in terms of what they're wanting. But as I look at Pacificors, look at Portland General's tariff processes, I am seeing a big push for a direct relationship between LSC and the CAISO. Obviously, if the LSC is still within the entity BA, you can't break out that reporting. It has to be done at the entity level. Only maybe LSCs that are SCs can have the sort of direct relationship and the more detailed reporting.
Thanks for that comment,
Stuart,
Stuart, on trends. I think that's helpful. And again, I think kind of getting that information from LSEs in terms of what they'd like to see is what we'll be getting to next. So take it away, Sylvie.
Yeah, and I think that's a great commentary on just what we've put in the market participant column, where today there's already an established line of communication in terms of data, in terms of information sharing and participation between the ISO and the BA. That's really the level at which things like settlements get done. And then the BA works with the LSE. So doing things at the LSE level requires a shift in this paradigm that may also impose costs to the LSE. So we're interested in hearing more about that, what that would mean in this context, and how that would change market participant impact.
I'm not seeing any other hands raised right now.
Well, feel free to raise your hand if you come up with any thoughts as I'm talking, and I'll continue to pause for questions.
Oh, we had a hand raised for a second, but it looks like it's down. Oh, there we go. We have a Lisa Case-Sweater.
Hi, thank you. This is Alyssa Case-Sweater with Bonneville. I guess I want to echo Stuart Kelly's statements a little bit. I think in this space, the appropriate place to measure is at the LSE level. And I guess I'm, even though Bonneville isn't really a load serving entity in that technical term, going to bunch us in that group because the BAA level is more of a transmission look at things, and that's the inappropriate look when you're talking about GHG accounting. It should be for Bonneville our power side. So looking at it from a BAA level is going to include a lot of resources that are not Bonneville's resources, for example, and should not be included in any GHG accounting that is attributed to Bonneville's participation in a market. So I hear you that there may be additional cost or sort of a paradigm shift. I think it would be good to get more information from the CAISO on what that would mean for implementation purposes and cost purposes, because I struggle to see value in BAA level reporting for us.
Thanks, Alyssa. And maybe to kind of preview some of what's to come in today's discussion, recognize that to produce this report at an LSE level, because our units of measure are at the scheduling coordinator or BAA level, kind of creates a new need for IT systems to have that mapping, to associate resources, not just with the scheduling coordinator, but with the load serving entity. And the other aspect that can incur costs relates to needing to associate contracts and validate those contracts, particularly if they're a short-term nature. And so some of the conversation today is also going to ask stakeholders, is there value in a incremental no-cost option at the BAA level? And today, as you're aware, we have kind of the current unspecified rate for transfers. We've been producing an average emissions rate that could be used for transfers. This is all in an effort to have a more accurate look at those unspecified transfers. And so some of the questions around BAA level later in this presentation are really going to be teed up of, is having that BAA level look an improvement on what's produced today? Does that solve anyone's long-term needs? Or is there kind of still a need to kind of disregard some of that incremental approach and simply move to the LSE level? And that's some of the information that's helpful for us to understand from stakeholders today. And so what I'm hearing so far is yes to LSE, but when it comes to, is there an incremental approach at the BAA level? Curious to hear more there. And I see Stuart's hand is back up.
Yeah, I think what I would make a distinction, yes, to LSC that is its own has its own SCID versus an LSC that's still, from a market perspective, dealt with as part of the entity. I would try and make that distinction, Anya, and I don't know if that makes a difference in terms of cost.
Okay,
I,
thank you for that
I would assume it
clarification.
does, but anyway.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
that's a
and we'll
good
be
point
discussing
where
a C approach later,
part
but
of
yeah,
part
go
of the
ahead,
list
Sylvie.
part of the list when it comes to LSC level is defining the LSC. So I think this second point under the CAISO impact column is relevant there, where today we have a means to facilitate data and communication between the ISO and a BA. There's also a means of doing this mapping and market participation straight between from the scheduling coordinator level. But the ISO does not require that an LSC is represented in the market in a particular way. So we understand that it's possible for an LSC to use multiple scheduling coordinators. It's possible that a single scheduling coordinator might represent multiple LSCs, or just the LSC's load, or just a few resources. So better understanding how to define an LSC for the purposes of market participation would be part of this discussion, and who to give authority to access ISO systems. Because again, today that's done by the scheduling coordinator. So there's a question of, do we need to identify someone at the LSC to have that business authority and that business access? But maybe I'll back up a second. Since we went down to the LSC level, I do want to review some of the stakeholder feedback we got, and very much heard that the LSC level is preferred by most stakeholders for a number of reasons. Some of those that we saw include an LSC level report would provide more precise tracking, would more easily reduce double counting, would be better aligned with state LSC specific targets, and would facilitate monitoring and analysis. So we do hear that this is broadly supported as preferable by stakeholders. So we wanted to identify some of the questions and the areas that we need to discuss further to get there. One of those elements is defining the LSC and how the LSC would participate and share information with the ISO. The ISO would have to build new systems in order to collect data, do the mapping between an LSC, what they own, what they contracted for, and what their load is. And we did want to identify a potential conflict with existing processes with state regulators, where it's possible that some state regulators would not want LSCs in the state to participate. A couple of the market participant impacts that we identified might arise. One is a financial cost. Because of the new systems involved to do this, there would likely be a financial cost where the LSC would pay a fee for the service. And there would be a new administrative cost where LSCs would need to manage the data inputs and outputs in order to facilitate this reporting. And I'll dive into a couple of questions that we had for the working groups. The first is, what are stakeholder suggestions for how LSCs would receive data? Again, today we have an ISO BA and an ISO scheduling coordinator channel for receiving and communicating information. So we'd like to hear how we might do this with an LSC, either through one of those channels or establishing a new authority or method of communication. Any thoughts or questions on why we're asking?
We have a hand raised by Patty. Patty, you should be unmuted now.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. I just for some feedback on the BAA level versus LSE level. This is Patty Sakowitz, Pacific Corp, and I do see a little call out at the top right here about MJEs. I think that's referring to multi-jurisdictional entities, of which Pacific Corp is, a proud member. And I will say that the information at a BAA level is the only level that would be useful to us at this time, because translating the BAA level information into the LSE level is different for multi-jurisdictionals based on the way our compliance is calculated. And so the way it would work is for an LSE level would be something that Pacific Corp would do internally and does internally now for compliance. But the BAA level information, the additional granularity there, it sounds like, if what I'm understanding is like that option is available in the interim, or that is like a shorter term solution, and that we would be really supportive of that information. But for us specifically, the advantages of the LSE level are kind of not applicable, and this is something we'd have to do internally.
Thanks, Patty, that's helpful to hear. I think that also provides some helpful insight into the second question, which is that for some BAs, it might be easier to facilitate the BA to the LSE level internally.
And I think this is where kind of in the post working group comments, we'll look for some feedback on kind of what works best for your organization. It sounds already from the conversation, folks are differently situated in terms of what would be helpful to them and why. So we'll definitely have a comment question on that in the template. I think I saw Claire's hand go up next.
Thank you, Anya. I wanted to give some feedback on the second question about how LSEs could receive data, as well as, well, I think it's kind of related to the next question about non-participating resources, own contracted resources. I guess in our minds, we've always seen a need for some sort of interface for each LSE, and that interface would allow both inputting of data, LSEs in particular, their information on contracted resources, as well as that interface would provide the mechanism by how they would receive their specific reports, because we would not see that LSE specific data is published. Certainly not at an individual level, it would have to be aggregated. So I think there's some questions that would have to be addressed around what's the appropriate frequency and what are the needs of doing that report and doing that aggregation. But we've thought that having an interface would probably be the most efficient way to do this. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire.
Next up, we have a hand raised by Stuart again.
Thank you. Just on Pacific Corp's point, and just need Kaiso to clarify, even if we did the reporting at the LSE level, my assumption was you would always have the BA level reporting also. It's not a case of either or. So can Kaiso confirm that even if you went to the LSE level, they will still be able to do BA level reporting? And then the second point is, if that's the direction we're headed in, I would see no reason if you can get to BA level reporting first that you wouldn't take that particular piece of reporting on more quickly, particularly if it aids, certain reporting in Oregon or Washington or wherever the push is coming from. So no reason not to stage an implementation if you're going for both BA and LSE level reporting. But surely if you've got LSE level, you will be getting BA level as well.
We had posted as a question to the working group of if the BAA level approach would add value as a no-cost option in the interim, and to really understand interest in the ultimate LSE level report, given the anticipated timeline and cost associated with developing that report. So really trying to understand, is there interest in the BAA level report, but once it's produced, I would anticipate we can continue producing it. Go ahead, Sylvie.
Thank you.
And we don't do the BAA level report today. We do the average emissions rate data that you see at a full system level on our website. So this would be an incremental change or an incremental effort. But as of right now, the ISO's perspective on this as an effort is that it's feasible as an interim. But as Anya said, we wanted to get stakeholder feedback to hear the value of putting the effort in to do that. And in the next couple of slides, I'll highlight a couple of additional questions that we might have around the BAA level. So the last category on here, if no one minds, I'll keep going, is the climate region. And we started talking about this in the last working group. We've heard from stakeholders some concerns around cost shifts and leaning or sharing attribution related to this idea of doing these reports at the climate region level. And we got support, and we heard support from Portland General. From the ISO's perspective, the impact here is really that we would require new rules from stakeholders to tell us how to establish a climate region. And so these questions are really for the working group. Who would get to be in a climate region? Does this need to be decided if the ISO produces raw data, or is it something that entities within the climate region can work out given the provision of data? And does the BA level approach alleviate the attribution concerns that some stakeholders brought up?
And this is Anya. As we're waiting for some feedback, maybe I'll add a little bit of color here of some of the previous concern that stakeholders expressed in comments regarding having a separate climate region at the LSE level really had to do with some of the leaning or kind of looking at if a region was attributed but a different climate region that doesn't have attribution get some of that credit, kind of the issues that could create. What we've kind of thought about and we'll be discussing later in this presentation is potentially kind of adapting that approach to be at a BAA level, and you could adapt that to have a climate region, and that would mean that any BAA that was a net exporter creates the climate region residual rate, and therefore none of those regions are having any energy attributed to them since they are net exporting. Maybe a question of how often that would occur, but in that way there isn't kind of this concern about attribution because it's at a BAA level, and the rate would be created based on net exporting BAAs. So I think there's some questions that we have for the group in terms of would an alternative approach change perceptions of this climate region, and we're looking for feedback on what it means to be in a climate region and how that might be decided by stakeholders, so that when we calculate a climate region residual rate, we have the necessary information. Alternatively, we could just produce each BAA's residual rate, and stakeholders could take that and do their own determination of what that climate region was. So hopefully that context helps kind of get some feedback. But I see Patty has her hand up first.
You should be unmuted now, Patty.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I actually did not mean to have my hand up, but I will take the opportunity to say something. Anya, I think you said, I do agree with you that if this kind of climate region were to be implemented, I think that it could, if I'm understanding the way it works, I think that it can be done out of market, if you will, that it can be done at a BAA level on paper, irrespective of the involvement from the CAISO, but I think what you're saying is that there's permutations in which it could be informed by CAISO's information. But if my understanding is that the approach is sort of a double click or an extension or an additional line item in the pre-market accounting that would happen on paper, and that there, like you say, this would sort of inform what a different residual mix would look like for this specific region. But I guess I don't, maybe you can explain a little bit on what CAISO would bring to that if it's not done out of market.
Sure. So I will back up and say we are only contemplating this out of market for all of the accounting and reporting approach, and for all of the residual rate. It's all envisioned as out of market. Maybe for a request for the event producer, could you jump to slide 19? So since we're getting into some of the details of what a BAA level climate region residual rate would look like, I think it might help this conversation to discuss this example a little bit further. And this is an example that looks at how would you create a residual rate for a net importing climate region BAA. And CAISO could take one of two approaches with developing this. In this example, what CAISO does is say, we are developing a one climate region residual rate by taking BAA2, which is this middle box, and BAA3, this bottom box, and essentially taking a weighted average of emissions in those BAAs. And that creates the climate region residual rate. And so that net importing climate region, with its first kind of tranche of shortfalls, so if this BAA has a shortfall of 600, the climate region has a net excess of 200 megawatts. Therefore, that importing region, the first 200 megawatts, they get to use the climate region residual rate. For the remaining 400 megawatts, they're using the non-climate region residual rate. So option one, which this example outlines, is CAISO producing one climate region residual rate based on knowing which BAAs are in the climate region. An alternative could be CAISO just produces the emissions rate for each BAA, and stakeholders then determine who is in the climate region based on their either state or voluntary objectives of determining which BAAs constitute being in a climate region or not in a climate region. And with that, I think we can go back to slide 9 and go back to that question of alternative approaches to a potential BAA climate region and maybe how that could be determined if it needs to be determined. So I see Nolan has his hand up. Could we unmute Nolan?
Should be unmuted now, Nolan.
Can you hear me
We
okay?
can try Yep, we can hear you.
Yes.
There we go. Thanks. That's it. Hi, Nolan Jones, Portland General Electric. Just really wanted to take the time to say we appreciate this active engagement that CAISO's had in developing this GHG working group, and we do appreciate all the comments from the stakeholder community. Some of you have asked for more information on PGE's proposal from the September working group. We are actively working to develop some solutions that entities with cleaner energy targets can work together to hopefully solve each other's excess in shortfall with our carbon-free resources as we build out into our targeted time frame. Also, some of the questions that we have pertaining to this climate region, we wanted to thank the ISO for even presenting on this. The climate region obviously is pretty impactful for those with policy constraints like Oregon. A few of the questions we have is who and how should it be decided who would be in this climate zone? Would it be a potential threshold limitation to get into this zone or maintain it? And then what are the rules of engagement to ensure the pool of residual market is representative of the diversity of clean resources that the residual market has to offer?
Those are good questions to get the ball rolling on discussion.
Yeah, so I think a threshold limit may be something that would be beneficial to talk about within the working group or outside it. You know, Oregon's constraint is pretty significant with a policy, but we are open to what a climate region may look like. But just curious what others on this call may have, what their view may be on a threshold limit regarding average emissions rate on an annual basis, or you know, what would be the opportunity to get into this region and maintain a clean energy status for this climate zone.
That's helpful. And just to put a finer point on that, you're looking for feedback on the suggestion of what if there was a threshold to be in that climate region? And, you know, for the sake of discussion, are you thinking of that as meeting that threshold on an annual basis, on a kind of what your installed capacity, what the anticipated emissions would be, or based on kind of what's generated on a 5-minute basis, so you could be in and out of the climate region? Are you viewing this as like a static, or
I think
is it
all options are good for discussion, right? I think any threshold is beneficial to ensure that if climate region is stood up for this residual rate, that, you know, that participants will have something to meet as a threshold to maintain status as we move towards more stringent targets. So I'd throw that back to the group.
Thank you. Maybe we can open up Claire's line in case she has thoughts on this or anything else related to the climate region.
Can you please unmute Claire?
thoughts. Asked when I first read this slide, I read it as climate religion, but that might be me. So I guess the comments from Nolan and Patty previously, I think, were very helpful. And, you know, I've thought about this more since Portland first raised this idea. And I think the way I'm approaching it in my head is this whole accounting framework that we're beginning to move towards setting up is intended, and I think we're all seeing it as a voluntary framework. We're not going to force anybody to join it, and it's up to an LSE to decide whether to join or not. And I kind of look at the issue of a climate region as being similar. It would be up to individual market participants, LSEs, who think it's beneficial for them to join some sort of climate regions. But what that is, in my view, is something different than a contract between an LSE and a generator. But it does, I think, would have to be premised on some sort of cooperative agreement between two or more utilities. If it's Portland, and let's say it's a utility in the desert Southwest with a lot of solar who has a voluntary mandatory goal and is interested in reducing their emissions associated with serving load, there's an opportunity here for those two utilities to get together and say, hey, it would be helpful to both of us if we agree that your excess serves my load first. So it's not necessarily a residual, but I think it's similar, but it's basically suggesting that somebody else that I have a partnership agreement with gets the right to use my excess or have it attributed to them for serving their own load before it goes to the market pool. That could be two entities, it could be multiple entities. I think the question of what emission rate, you know, if there is an emission rate requirement to get into that, I think that's relevant for the utilities who agree to participate in such an arrangement, but I'm not sure it's something that we need to try to set rules for. You know, you could have 2 or 3 utilities who want a really, really low emission rate who are interested in doing this, and maybe some others who want a higher emission rate. Maybe they have a, you know, maybe those two don't get together. But it seems to me that the approach that we should take within this working group in the CAISO is think about, is there a framework that we could set up that would allow those sort of cooperative agreements to take place and be reflected in the accounting? Thank you.
Thanks,
As you
Claire.
were talking, I was thinking about, sorry, Anya. I was thinking about how, you know, on the slide we're thinking through new systems, data collection, how we define the LSE. So is your vision sort of part of that, where you can define your LSE or your, you know, the area at which we define the market participant here? That could be multiple LSEs that sort of agree to be reported on together.
And I think what I'm also hearing in this, and I'd like feedback, is, you know, we've received feedback that folks want raw data for this. And what I'm hearing from Claire's thoughts and suggestions is that almost if the CAISO were to produce any of this information for a residual rate, whether it's BAA or LSE, if we do it at a kind of unit level rather than being the ones to aggregate, it allows LSEs or BAAs to come up with their own agreement to say, yes, based on the data that we have, that we receive from CAISO for our own BAA or our own LSE, we're going to go into an agreement to say we're going to share, you know, emission factors because we are our own climate region. And that can all take place outside of the market. And the CAISO's role here is really just producing either the data at a BAA or LSE level for each BAA or LSE, so that can be accomplished. But Claire, I'd like to maybe hear some reactions to that, and if that gets at that objective.
Are we able to unmute Claire one more time? There we go.
Yeah, I'll answer your question first, Anya. I guess I don't feel I'm in a position to know whether that's sufficient to Portland and any other entity that wants this information. I think to the extent that you provide raw data, as long as you provide it in a way that allows them to pull the information out of it that they need. So in other words, the raw data from that particular climate region, it's not sufficient to just dump out all the raw data for the entire footprint. They have to be able to say, oh, this is the stuff that's left over from my footprint. Sylvia, would you repeat your question?
I was sort of just spitballing here, but given, you know, your previous comments around having these new systems, the back and forth we had around defining the LSC, and in the next couple of slides, we'll get to this, but one of the, you know, proposals has been to validate owned and contracted resources through a handshake. So I was thinking about translating your idea into something like, could two LSCs sort of enter into this system with an agreement, and the ISO would model them together and provide that data in aggregate to whoever requests to be grouped?
Yeah, I think that aligns with the way I've been thinking about it. And I don't know if it's necessarily modeled together. I think I see it more as there's a one additional level before excess energy goes into the residual. So let's say there are 3 LSCs in this little group. One of them short, 2 of them are long. That length is basically is being attributed to the entity that's short before it's attributed to the market residual. But yes, I think having some sort of validation through a handshake or whatever of the 3 LSCs involved to confirm that they've agreed to this arrangement would be important.
Thanks, Claire.
Not seeing any other hands raised, Sylvie and Anya.
All right. So the next 2 slides are intended to break down the decision points between BA level, LSC level, or other into what the challenges or implications are between supply and demand. Let's go to the next slide and talk about load modeling. At a BA level, this is something that the ISO already does today, where we measure load at a BA level. So we have an existing process to do that. And for settling at the BA level, we've also heard from the market participants today that doing this at the BA level could facilitate BAs then translating to an LSC level report or compliance. But then the next level down is for the ISO to do the load modeling at the LSC level. And one of the possibilities for this is that we've heard from stakeholders is that LSCs would provide their load data directly to the ISO. The ISO would need to build new systems and create new business processes to allow the ISO to receive this load data. As I noted on the previous slide, we have this coordination between BAs and scheduling coordinators, but would need to get something from an LSC somehow. So that's both technology and business process. In terms of impact to the market participant, this would mean LSCs would need to come up with load data. But the question that we really want to talk about here is, what does that load data look like? Given that it's something LSCs would need to provide to the ISO in a new business way, and it's something that the ISO would need to collect now, should we expect load forecasting data, or is this something that would be based on actual metered data? Do we need alignment on that? In other words, should there be an expectation that LSEs across the board provide the same granularity or the same quality of load data? And I'll pause there to get reactions.
Is a hand raised by Stuart?
Hey, Sylvie, I'm not convinced that the ISO has to establish new systems to maybe receive LSE load forecasts. And I think if we look at what's happening with entities and as they develop tariffs and different things, specifically RSE modeling and imbalance reserves and allocations, I think you're going to find that most entities will be producing LSE forecasts themselves in order to allocate those components. So I think it's not necessarily asking the CAISO necessarily to produce that data, but I think you may find that the entities will be producing that data themselves. And as I say, if they're actually, and I make this distinction between, you know, LSEs that have their own SCIDs, that information can readily be provided to the CAISO within existing systems and constructs. It is a new process, but it's not something that would be hard to do. So it would be helpful to understand why CAISO thinks new systems would be needed.
I'm going to unpack this a little bit. One of the things I heard you say is that an LSE with an LSE ID, this might be easier for. It's not my understanding that that's consistent across the board for all LSEs in the market footprint. So I'd be interested in hearing more from other LSEs that might have a different business process. But I do hear you on the idea that this might not be, to create this data for an LSE, it might not be a huge or a new list, given that people are starting to do it already. So from the ISO's perspective, the question is really, how do you want to give it to us? How do we receive it? And do we need alignment for the purposes of creating this report on what that data looks like? If everyone's creating this data, but it all gets aggregated and turned into this GHG report, we may need some consistency to ensure that we're properly accounting for every hour and every megawatt.
Next up, we have a question from Claire.
Yeah, thanks again. I think I'm with Stuart on this one. I guess we've always thought about this as the allocation happens relative to actual metered load. And it's not clear to me why you would need a forecast of that in any way. I mean, maybe, as Stuart said, LSEs are doing it for themselves to think about, you know, whether it's or hour, but unless I'm missing something, it's not clear to me.
Claire, you're breaking up a little bit. Are you able to get closer to your mic?
Is this better?
Yes.
Yeah.
How much did you hear?
I think we heard a majority of it, that you're kind of looking to understand why the CAISO would need a forecast, and that the vision had been that this would be based on actuals. Maybe I'll just share that we've received some feedback that some entities might want to have this based on kind of forecasted load rather than metered load. I think what we're looking to understand here is this something where we need stakeholder alignment in terms of what load is used, that if a residual rate or the full report is produced at an LSE level, that everyone is using a common measurement for their load, whether that is everyone doing that based on actual or everyone doing it based on forecast, or if there can be some mixing and matching of approaches based on that LSE's kind of desire on how they represent their load. So we're highlighting this question based on feedback we've received that some might be more interested in forecast, and utilizing that. We don't have the right SMEs on this call, but at least in our internal discussions around obtaining load information, the feedback we've received is, yes, it would require new systems to be able to pull that in to create this report. So just a little bit more background on why this working group coordination question was prompted.
So I guess one more thought then. I think it has to be actual, because if it's forecast, then the energy and emissions that you allocate to load is not going to match reality. It may be short, maybe high, but it won't match. The only way you can actually match generated energy to load is if you use actual.
Curious if there's any other perspectives on this topic. Thanks, Claire.
Not currently seeing any hands raised at the moment.
Before we move on, I do want to make a distinction. I'm giving it a shot here to interpret something that Stuart said, but I do want to make a distinction between load that's bid into the market and load that's metered for settlement purposes. These are two different things. Our settlements team uses metered load, and that's different from what scheduling coordinators bid in. There are two different sources of how you might measure load. And as far as my understanding goes, different LSCs may have different processes for this. There may not be, exact metering across all LSCs in the West. So it would be helpful for us to get more information on how feasible it is to establish a standard, I guess, for the purposes of GHG reporting. Maybe I'll let that simmer for a bit, and let us know if you have any questions around that distinction or further thoughts on load modeling. I think for now, let's go to the next slide. Contract granularity. So this is a question that was in the comments template where we asked if the ISO should accept contracts that are greater than 10 days out. And this is something we discussed last time where the master file requires 10 days to update. So if you have a scheduling coordinator, they can update things that are owned and contracted for 10 days out, but not less than that. Or if we would need a way to make sure that the ISO can include contracts and ownership in this report that are less than 10 days out or something more dynamic. So what we heard from stakeholders is that no one opposed the idea of accepting contracts only 10 days out, but requested further discussion around this topic. Some stakeholders pointed out that long-run policies may not require LSEs to show compliance in short-run intervals, so it's possible that there may not be a regulatory obligation here. But we did see stakeholder support around including contracts more dynamically. One specific and useful piece of feedback that we saw was that ensuring that the ISO includes contracts more dynamically would support the use of these short-term, low-carbon specified contracts. So now we'll discuss a little bit what the impacts are and the differences between the impact to the ISO of accepting only contracts 10 days out versus more dynamically. So today, the ISO has an expectation that information provided to the ISO is accurate and subject to audit. there wouldn't be a huge lift in terms of validating new sources of information here. It's possible that this would require new IT systems, depending on further discussions here on just exactly what types of contracts we're talking about. And we would need rules from stakeholders in order to help us develop the IT systems that would approve or reject this kind of contracting information. And so this idea of new systems and new rules around contracts is applicable, whether we're talking about dynamic contracts or longer term contracts. The incremental difference here for more dynamic contracts is that we would definitely require new systems if stakeholders identify a real need for the ISO to reflect and attribute these contracts more dynamically. I'll move on to some potential market participant impacts we identified. Today, scheduling coordinators manage contract ownership. They have the ability to change the master file, enter the resource IDs, etc. If we include contracts more dynamically, there's a question of who would be in charge of this. We would need to create a new business practice in order to update the ISO systems. Someone would need to manage conflicts, confirm ownership of shared capacity, and there would be a financial cost to the ISOs building and building these systems and validating this information. Sorry, I went down in the opposite order there. So I'll jump into the working group coordination questions here. The one question we had on the top is the role of validation necessary? Again, today we already have a process where there's just an expectation that this information is accurate and scheduling coordinators manage these things. Are there different types of contracts or contractual arrangements for the purposes of GHG? Or within the context of policy, where we hear different definitions of double counting that might necessitate an additional layer of validation. And we'd like to hear more about what types of contracts fall in either of these categories, but in particular within the 10-day window that would require more dynamic mapping. Any questions with how we've characterized the items on this slide? Some of the impacts that we've put here, any new impacts that you see, responses to the working group coordination questions?
Just got a hand raised from Claire.
Hi, thanks again. Can you remind me, I'm trying to recall for the supply that's contracted to the greenhouse gas pricing areas. Can you remind me what, if any, validation is done?
Today?
Well, once EDAM goes live.
I think that would fall into this top column where we have an existing business practice for scheduling coordinators to manage this. And so the validation is really just that there's this expectation that what is provided to the ISO is accurate and you're subject to audit.
There's no double checking with the counterparty. It's just the onus is on the coordinator to get it right.
Yeah, that's the obligation of the scheduling coordinator. That's their role, yeah.
Okay. The thing about this, at least from WPTF's perspective, I think it's something we would want to think more about. I guess, in my personal view, the role of validation is to avoid conflicts, competing claims to the same energy. And as states and voluntary greenhouse gas goals get tighter over time, that might become more important. Just a thought.
And today we do have rules in the system that will reject information where the system identifies a conflict. We would need, or we would like, stakeholder feedback on if and how those rules should evolve for the purposes of GHG. Right now, they're very limited to, what the market needs today. That's things that are associated with the scheduling coordinator, with bidding and with settlement. So it's possible that we would need to evolve this process. If we don't have any other comments, we can go to the last slide. Report medium and format. So what we broadly heard from stakeholders is that raw data would be optimal. This would support different methodologies, different regional requirements. From the ISO's perspective, we provide raw data on the average emissions rate today, doing so at different at BA level or LSC level, et cetera, would require validation and aggregation, and in some cases a methodology to anonymize or fill in the blanks where data is missing in order to ensure data privacy. We've heard that providing this level of data may require a list on behalf of market participants or regulators, where stakeholders might have to explain to regulators how the data works, learn how to input or receive that sort of data and interpret it. And I'll just breeze through this, but in previous working group coordination discussions, and as we were talking through the average emissions rate, we've already noted that we would need modeling assumptions for certain things like imports and exports from outside the market footprint, storage, demand response. And this question of public or private applies to the next row as well. So I'll go through the next row and then we can pause for questions. But the second option here is having a single defined metric. One stakeholder commented that this would really be helpful for harmonization and analysis and to reduce the potential for double counting. Some stakeholders that note that a defined metric can provide an alternative where the ISO cannot provide sufficiently granular data, but for the most part, we heard support for raw data. And we wanted to provide this caveat, and this caveat really applies to everything we're talking about here today, but should the ISO provide raw data or should the ISO provide a single defined metric, this should be used for informational purposes only. Something that we identified from that may impact market participants is the need to understand the metric. So the ISO would need to provide sufficient transparency and education surrounding how we calculate this metric in order for it to be effective. And a question that I'll pause and leave with the working group for the moment is, what are the implications of providing this information publicly versus privately? I think on the first slide when we were discussing LSE versus BA, we heard a lot of benefit from having choice around voluntarily managing this information after the fact. So that implies a lot of this information needs to be public. But again, there's a trade-off associated with aggregation and data privacy. So I'll pause there.
I'm not currently seeing any other hands raised at the moment.
Just out of respect for time, I'll finish up this slide, and if anyone has further thoughts on report medium and format, feel free to jump in. We've heard most stakeholders recommend the more granular, the better. So for now, I've just put recommended 5-minute granularity, but let us know if you have any other thoughts on that, given the decision points we've discussed today. Frequency with which the ISO publishes these reports. We heard from 3 different utilities that they recommended either quarterly or annually. Today, we provide the ability for market participants to submit a city ticket if they identify errors with ISO provided information. So we can continue that practice. One of the questions that we had from market participants or potential market participant impact is, would there be a resolution period, post-publication revisions, and how would that impact business practices if the ISO provided a period within which to identify errors, resolve issues, and then republish this information? And a question to end on is, should there be any changes to the ISO's current process for fixing errors via city ticket? For example, it would be helpful to hear, make sure you fix all errors within 90 days because we are not able to continually update this information beyond some date due to regulatory requirements.
Not currently seeing any hands raised, Sylvie.
All right, well, we'll put this in the comment template, so continue to think about it, and we look forward to hearing your feedback. Move on to the next slide.
All right, well, thanks, Sylvie. This will be another feedback session really related to the residual emissions rate. And maybe to kick this off and kind of discussions around different approaches we could take to a residual, I'm going to first take us back to a summary of the basic outline of the formula for the accounting and reporting approach. So in whole, the proposal adds what was dispatched by the market, net of what was attributed. And this is done because any energy attributed was really meant to serve another region, not the entity in question. And then if load is less than what was dispatched, the report credits back at an LSE rate. But if load is greater, if dispatch is less than load, you would then add in what was purchased from the market at a residual emissions rate. And that would come up with the final total of the emissions the entity is responsible for. And so some of the reasons we're going to be talking about the residual emissions rate next is it's the one piece of information that stakeholders likely don't have. Likely, if you're an entity that wants this report, you know what your owned and contracted resources are, you know what attribution took place, and by knowing what your resources are and what was dispatched by the market, you can create your own LSE emissions rate. It's really creating a residual emissions rate for what was purchased from the market that's missing. And there's different approaches that we could take with this residual, and there's different trade-offs that we're going to consider in the upcoming slides. We're also talking about the residual emissions rate because of the feedback that we've received from stakeholders on its value, which I'll sum up as kind of producing something that's more accurate than the current unspecified or average rate, that it can reduce double counting if we're able to remove claimed capacity. And it can enable stakeholders to show progress that they're making towards their climate goals. And if the CAISO moves in the direction of just producing raw data, it would likely just be producing this residual emissions rate number because the other information should be known by the entity that wants to produce this report. So let's move to the next slide. So I'll be discussing a few example approaches for quote unquote a residual rate. Some of these are closer to averages, and so you can debate the true meaning of residual here, but really I'll be talking about it done at a BAA level, an LSE level as the original proposal was constructed, and at the scheduling coordinator level. And the examples highlight that you could do a basic level BAA residual by weighting net exporting BAA emissions net of what's attributed. And we're focusing here on those net exporting BAAs because they're really setting the residual rate for what a net importing BAA would consume. We talked a little bit in Sylvie's slides about the kind of adaptation of this BAA approach with the climate region. And this methodology, in short, is going to allow a climate region to use a climate region specific emission factor for surplus prior to using a non-climate region emissions factor. But it does follow the previous BAA level residual weighted net export by weighting net exporting BAAs, but it does separate it out by climate versus non-climate region. The LSE level is really an average of the unowned or uncontracted dispatched resources to create that residual rate net of what's attributed to California or Washington. And doing this at a scheduling coordinator level would be the average of the scheduling coordinator emissions or affiliate group emissions that have a net surplus net of what's attributed to California or Washington. So let's go to the next slide. We talked about just at a high level that there could be costs associated with the implementation of the LSE residual approach. And because this is still being developed, we don't necessarily have enough information to say this is what the exact cost would be. But to give a ballpark estimate of just the fact that there would be costs and there would be kind of implementation timelines to consider, we wanted to at least provide a comparison of how to think about some of the residual rate options in light of cost to participant and the implementation timeline. And so with an LSE residual being more of an EDM Day 2 enhancements because it does include new systems to associate generation and load with the LSE, as well as having new systems to associate contracts kind of closer to the day-ahead market with the LSE, it is going to take time to implement and cost to participants. So we also wanted to see if there was value in introducing an interim solution that was either lower cost or no cost. And that would be creating a scheduling coordinator level residual rate that we already essentially consume information at a SC level. There could be grouping that could be representative of what an LSE has based on that grouping, but the cost would really be a result of needing to do that contract association and needing to have systems that can support that effort. And whereas the BAA level or BAA with climate region largely leverages information that we already have today. And so that is something that at least under kind of the current design might be a no-cost option that could be available with EDAM Go Live. So wanted to present this estimate of what might be available with EDAM Go Live versus later on, recognizing that a lot of details still need to be figured out in terms of which report stakeholders would like and when it has value and if there is really value in developing something like this BAA level or BAA with a climate region approach. Next slide.
Yes, we do have a hand raised by Claire.
Sure, go ahead, Claire.
Yeah, just a question, and understand if you can't hear me. Would you be able to quantify or tell us to what extent scheduling coordinator gets us to LSE? Where it's like, you know, a lot of LSEs out there, we're not PAs, but have a
Claire, you're breaking up a little bit, but
just, I was hoping
if I can play that back.
Yeah, I was hoping
Claire,
you more information to assess how close a scheduling coordinator gets us to LSE, just to assess whether it's worth doing in the meantime.
I think this might be a good question for the comment template to understand from LSEs or entities that are interested in this. Because we don't have information to be able to answer that question, Claire, of how close does the SC get to LSE? And in fact, we'd like to hear from stakeholders of how close does this get you to the LSE level? And so if entities are able to provide a mapping to say, these are all of the resource IDs that are associated kind of with my SC level residual, and if that happens to be your LSE, that is helpful to know, and so it could equate there. I think it's more of a question of, we recognize not every LSE is their kind of scheduling coordinator for all of their resources, but with appropriate mapping, we think that this could largely get close to that if LSE can map, hey, these are all of the resource IDs associated with my generation. Okay, Sylvie, did you want to talk about the scorecards?
Yeah, I've got two example scorecards that I'll go through quickly. Again, this is not the final arbiter of feasibility. We're just putting it out there to illustrate where some of the trade-offs are and where we want to end up. So this is an example of how we might score the BA level residual emissions rate as a solution. This is something that would be at the BA level. We wouldn't require any changes from how contracts are reported and validated today. So the only red flag there is from the stakeholder perspective, where we've heard that would not help to support policies or the use of, say, clean energy, short-term clean energy contracts. And the idea behind the solution is that the ISO would provide a public metric, not necessarily full, granular, publicly available data due to privacy and aggregation concerns, but in this version of a solution, we would be able to provide this metric publicly. So yeah, this is where you see the most green dots, and probably still some areas of discussion required, but lowest hanging fruit that we could identify. Let's go to the next slide. By comparison, this would be our initial scorecard for an LSE level residual emissions rate. This is at the LSE level. This would include more dynamic contract validation, and the report format would be in raw data. And in many instances, we would likely report this raw data straight to the LSE where applicable. So the red dots are mostly within the context of impacts to the ISO and impacts to the market participant, where we would need to develop new systems and we would require new business processes for market participants to either provide us with new information or to be able to accept new information, interpret that, and do something with it. But you see in the stakeholder priority that this is This is the area where we've heard the most support, the LSC level, and in terms of report format. And I'll pass it back to Anya to talk about some of these methodologies more in depth.
Thanks, Sylvie. So I realized we got a little bit of a preview of this earlier on. The objectives of this next set of slides are really to kind of provide some examples for what these residual rates could look like, and we'll be looking for your feedback in the comment template on, you know, if there's value in having kind of short-term approach, an interim approach with a BAA level or BAA level with the climate region versus SC level versus LSE. And so thought it would be helpful to have some examples to clarify what this could look like. With the BAA level residual, you have the residual rate set by the net exporting BAAs. And so on the left-hand side, I have two BAAs, BAA1 and 2. And when you look at kind of their load versus what was dispatched by the market, so their kind of total assigned energy for BAA1 is 600, their load is only 500, so they've contributed 100 megawatts to the residual supply. Looking at kind of the emissions associated with their fleet, it looks like that means that this contribution to residual supply has emissions factor of 0.167 metric tons per megawatt hour. And then we go through the same exercise for a second BAA to come up with a BAA level residual rate so that a net importing BAA has that residual rate to use. And I want to be clear that there is kind of one BAA level residual rate per 5-minute interval. This is just a simplified example with just 3 BAAs within the system. So this is one approach that we could take. Another approach that we talked through is on our next slide. And I apologize, actually, could we move to the next slide, slide 19 again? I apologize, there's a typo in the summary. This should refer to BAA level residual for the climate region, where you kind of first take the shortfall, or the net importing BAA first gets to say, my first tranche of shortfall energy gets to use the climate region residual rate, and my second tranche, if applicable, uses the non-climate region shortfall. And so in this example, you're first calculating what the climate region residual rate is using a similar approach where you're looking at each BAA's total emissions to create that weighted average for the climate region. And you're creating in that same 5-minute interval a kind of emissions rate for the non-climate region. And that way, when you have that net importing climate region, you can allocate emissions from both the climate region and non-climate region, depending on the extent of the shortfall. I'll note here, to kind of go back to our previous conversation, the CAISO could also take an approach of just producing the emissions rate for each BAA, which would then allow BAAs to decide and come to agreements together to say, you know, yes, you're in my climate region, without the CAISO producing a climate region residual rate and non-climate region residual rate. We could just produce residual rates for BAAs, and there could be stakeholder decisions around what constitutes that climate region. The next slide, slide 20, reviews this at a scheduling coordinator level. And here, this could be done for scheduling coordinators or kind of the affiliate group if there is a grouping that should be done for what scheduling coordinators best represent an entity. And I think this kind of goes back to Claire's question of, you know, how close can this get to an LSE? And I think there's an open question of the willingness for LSEs to do this mapping and then share this with the CAISO. But the basic methodology is that you would kind of group together scheduling coordinators. I'm just highlighted them within BAAs for context to say, we've got a GHG non-priced area A, a second BAA is a GHG non-priced area B, and then we have, this third BAA, I had intended this to be a priced region. And for the sake of this example, it doesn't matter, but effectively what's happening is the regions or the scheduling coordinators with surplus are setting the residual rate for the scheduling coordinators that have a demand shortfall. And so it's really a combination of the scheduling coordinator that have that surplus. So in this case, scheduling coordinator 1 and scheduling coordinator 4 are setting the residual rate, so that when you look at scheduling coordinator 2 and 3, which both have demand shortfalls, their residual or emissions rate is really being set by those scheduling coordinators that have that surplus. And then moving ahead to the next example, in the interest of time and getting to George's presentation, the LSE level residual rate, this is the WPTF example where you have kind of an LSE that is a net purchaser, you have an LSE that is a net buyer, and if they are purchasing from the market, they are essentially accounting for their purchase at the kind of market level residual rate based on uncontracted supply. And if they are kind of a net buyer, they're able to kind of get credit back at their LSE specific emissions rate. So we hope these examples help foster kind of a better understanding of some of the options for the residual rate. We're also open to feedback on permutations of this in terms of what stakeholders would like to see in some of these interim approaches. And with that, I will, there's another approach that we could also take outside of having residual rates at different granularities, such as the BAA, LSE, or scheduling coordinator, and that is to look at locational emissions. We have had various discussions in the working group to have some form of locational emissions and that there would be value in that. When we first started the working group, there were stakeholders submitted problem statements that related to wanting to know locational information around emissions for contracting reasons, for the development and siting of resources, for 24/7 matching and load shifting. And we've also heard stakeholders say they want more visibility into the emissions associated at different locations at the LMP level. We've even heard some stakeholders express interest in understanding what a marginal emissions rate could be in potential use cases, and to that end have requested nodal data on emissions. So we recognize there's no single standard methodology for calculating this, but as some potential options moving forward, we wanted to discuss, in contrast to having the SC, LSE, or BAA level residual, is another kind of framework for us to use to think about having the marginal emissions rate at a generation node. So whatever the marginal resource or set of marginal resources, because sometimes there can be more than one resource that is marginal, they would kind of be averaged to create a marginal emissions rate at each generation node in RTD. Another approach that we could take is to have average emissions rate at each generation node, and this would kind of look at that average for each 5-minute interval versus today what we have is an average of all resources dispatched in RTD, and we've been posting on that on our website for some time and have run through that methodology with the working group in the past. So a few different ways for us to think about the residual rate or locational emissions, and are interested in the working group's feedback on what best serves kind of your reporting needs, or if there is value in this kind of locational approach in contrast to having this at an entity level. And we'll have more questions about this in the comment template. So with that, I'll turn things back to Christina for our break.
Thanks, Anya. So with that, we can take about a 10-minute break, would you say? Come back at 8-minute break, come back at 2:50?
Sounds great.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Next, we're going to hear from George regarding greenhouse gas counterfactual. George?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. So this portion of the presentation will touch on the greenhouse gas counterfactual, and will present and compare at a high level various approaches. So let's go to the next slide. So first of all, let's start with why we need a counterfactual. So to review a few terms that we'll be using here, our methodology is based on resource-specific greenhouse gas attributions. And these are attributions that are calculated optimally in the IFM for resource schedule portions that are attributed to net import into greenhouse gas regulation areas. And these greenhouse gas attributions bring the element of the secondary dispatch into the forum here, where the secondary dispatch is a phenomenon, whereas resources external to a greenhouse gas regulation area receive attributions for serving demand in that greenhouse gas area through imports into it, then other resources that are external have to backfill for that resource capacity that's attributed now to serve demand inside the greenhouse gas area instead of outside. And it is possible that these resources that are backfilling attributions represent a higher emission than the emission of the attributions, and that generates potentially an additional emission cost in terms of atmospheric cost that is not captured in the IFM solution or in any market solution. It escapes that solution, and we don't have a good picture in the optimal solution about what is the ultimate atmospheric cost. We report benefits because the displacement of higher emitting resources in the greenhouse gas regulation area with attributions from lower emitting resources outside is a benefit in terms of CO2 and emission costs, but that completely ignores the effect that secondary dispatch may have in the atmospheric cost. So to counter that, we have mechanisms in our market to reduce as much as we can the effect of the secondary dispatch. And one of these methods, and potentially the most effective one, is the greenhouse gas counterfactual. The counterfactual essentially finds an optimal solution without having greenhouse gas attributions. And then it uses that at a resource-specific level as a reference to essentially limit the greenhouse gas attribution that the resources external to a greenhouse gas regulation area can receive to the volume of their bid capacity that has not been scheduled in the counterfactual. Essentially saying, well, if the counterfactual gives you a baseline solution that doesn't have greenhouse gas attributions, and then you have in the IFM greenhouse gas attributions on top of that baseline solution, then let's make sure that the volume of the greenhouse gas attributions is limited to the bid capacity that is not used for the greenhouse counterfactual schedules. So this is the reason why we use the counterfactual, and there are several ways to come up with a counterfactual. Let's go to the next slide. So we will show you here some of the methodologies for calculating counterfactual. In the middle column is what we have as the California ISO method, which is filed and approved by FERC. This counterfactual is exactly like the IFM, same identical solution, except for the fact that we ignore the greenhouse gas bids. So if we ignore the greenhouse gas bids, obviously there's no net import into the greenhouse gas regulation areas because there's nothing to attribute, right? There's no mechanism to make the attribution. But this method, being the same as the IFM otherwise, allows optimal transfers between balancing authority areas. So it achieves full economic displacement outside of the greenhouse gas regulation area, but prevents economic displacement of resources within a greenhouse gas regulation area with resources outside. Another method, the one on the right, proposed by Vestra and others, is very similar, except for the fact that there is a restriction to not have transfers between balancing authority areas. So you look at the transfers, and you essentially restrict also economic displacement outside of greenhouse gas regulation areas between BAAs. Another methodology that I want to present here that we haven't had the chance to discuss in this forum, to give you more of a global view of where you can go with a counterfactual, is actually moving in the opposite direction. And that's the left column. And for lack of a better name, I call it the no GHG cost. This is similar to the IFM. It's a full optimization. And we again ignore the greenhouse gas bids, but there is an additional step here. Here we also ignore the greenhouse gas cost component in the energy bids of resources inside a greenhouse gas regulation area. So there's no greenhouse gas cost in the entire market footprint. All right. And other than that, it's an optimal solution, which also allows for net import into the greenhouse gas regulation areas, which is the import that would have happened if you completely disregard the cost of greenhouse gas. Of course, you have also full economic displacement, not only outside the greenhouse gas areas between balancing authority areas with optimal transfers, but also between greenhouse gas regulation areas and the external world. So let's go to the next slide and start talking a little bit more in detail on what these counterfactual methods do. So for the ISO counterfactual method, we basically answer the question, what would have been the optimal solution if greenhouse gas regulation areas were not in the market footprint? Because that counterfactual is calculating the optimal solution for resources outside the greenhouse gas regulation areas without import into the greenhouse gas regulation areas. And that external resource counterfactual schedule will use it as a reference to limit the attribution in the IFM. If there are no greenhouse gas bids, then there are no greenhouse gas attributions, as there is no net import in the greenhouse gas regulation areas, you'll have the same solution that you would essentially have if you cut out the greenhouse gas regulation areas from the market footprint. But this solution allows full economic displacement outside of the greenhouse gas areas, so it comes in par with what the IFM will do. So if there is any potential for economic displacement between BAAs, it's allowed in this solution. Next slide, please.
George, there's a hand raised by Callie if you want to take a moment for questions.
I'll open for question after I discuss all of them. I think,
Okay.
unless it's a really pressing question, let's go through all of them, discuss the details, and then we'll open for question. So
Sounds good.
for the greenhouse, thank you. For the counterfactual proposed by Vistra and others, this one answers the question, same question as before. For the first part, what would have been the optimal solution if greenhouse gas regulation areas were not in the market footprint? But also, what would have been the solution if there were no transfers between balancing authority areas? Again, without greenhouse gas bids, there's no attribution. Without attribution, there's no import into greenhouse gas regulation areas, same as before. But now with also no BAA transfers, then each BAA supply meets the BAA demand. So here, not only you carve out the greenhouse gas regulation areas, but you also isolate each BAA and you say, let's find a counterfactual if each BAA is a single market by itself. There is no interaction between BAAs. Next slide. So this no GHG cost method, as I call it, is a different counterfactual approach that answers the question, what would have been the optimal solution if there was no GHG cost at all in the market footprint? If there was no GHG regulation, find me the optimal solution, what would that be? Again, we remove here the GHG cost, the energy bids. And also there are no GHG bids from external resources, which results in no GHG attributions. So this is like a full optimization disregarding completely greenhouse gas regulation. Obviously, you will have an optimal solution that would have net import into greenhouse gas regulation areas here. So this counterfactual is different than the other two. You will have imports into the greenhouse gas regulation areas that just happen because of pure economic displacement of energy bids without reflecting any greenhouse gas cost. We'll use this import in this methodology as a reference for greenhouse gas attributions in IFM. I'll show you the details in the next slide, but we do allow here optimal BAA transfers exactly like in IFM. So this is a full optimal solution. There is economic displacement anywhere in the market footprint, it takes place. So let's see how we use this reference for imports into this. Maybe I should stop here for some burning questions, although some of them may be answered next. So let's see if there are any questions at this point before we go further.
We have one hand raised by Callie.
Yes, Callie.
Hey, George, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. Not burning, so if you want to wait until you get through all your slides, that's totally fine.
Okay, yeah, let's wait so that we have an overall view of all these things, so that then we can answer these questions better, I think.
Yeah, sorry.
Let's go to the next slide.
I was waiting.
Okay, thank you, Callie. Now, to get into some comparison between this and answer some of the questions in our mind, let's complete the picture and see how the settlement takes place in our greenhouse gas model. So we have always a counterfactual in place. It doesn't matter how we will achieve the solution for the counterfactual, but we will have one that will give us a reference schedule for each external resource. All right. Each external resource that has a greenhouse gas bid for a greenhouse gas regulation area, and there will be different bids for different greenhouse gas regulation areas that they can have. We limit the attribution that can be given to this greenhouse gas bid to the volume of the available bid capacity above the greenhouse gas reference from the counterfactual. So it's the upper economic limit of the bid, how much is the entire volume that is in the market, but we subtract the greenhouse gas reference because we say this would have happened already in the reference, so let's find out how much more we can attribute. Then the net import into a greenhouse gas regulation area in IFM is allocated to greenhouse gas attributions to that area. It's allocated optimally based on the combined cost of the energy bid plus the greenhouse gas cost for external resources compared to the energy bid of internal resources, which already includes a greenhouse gas cost component. In this attribution, it's a constraint when it's binding, which is when you have an import into the greenhouse gas regulation area. The shadow pressure of that constraint, which is binding, is the marginal greenhouse gas cost for imports into that greenhouse gas regulation area, and it is reflected as the fourth component of the locational marginal price for nodes into that greenhouse gas regulation area. So it's used for both paying supply and charging demand in that greenhouse gas regulation area. Because of the settlement, the energy settlement for supply and demand resources now in the greenhouse gas regulation area, the market operator collects revenue, what we call the greenhouse gas revenue. How is this revenue coming about? It's because you have less supply than demand in the greenhouse gas regulation area because you have imports, right? Imports cleared. So when you charge the load and you pay the supply, you're left with some amount of money, which is really your greenhouse gas revenue. And then you turn around and you pay that out to the attributions for the greenhouse gas attribution. So essentially, you pay the attribution that marginal greenhouse gas cost. That keeps the market operator neutral because whatever you collect, in the IFM at least, you pay out to attributions. So that's how the settlement works. And it works exactly the same way in the ISO counterfactual approach and in the Vistra counterfactual approach, but it works a little different now in the NODE-GHG approach so that we can have a global view of this. Let's go to the next slide and describe that part. So in the NODE-GHG cost counterfactual method, the net import into a greenhouse gas regulation area that cleared in the counterfactual, we take this as a reference. We say this would have been the import that would clear anyway, because if you ignore the greenhouse gas cost, okay, then this is the economic displacement between internal and external resources, just purely economic displacement. So we take this as a reference, and now we modify the greenhouse gas allocation constraint by changing the right-hand side and say, let's only attribute imports into the greenhouse gas regulation area that are above that reference. So basically the reference becomes a demarcation line for the imports. We say we have a reference import, and then anything that is imported in the IFM now above that reference, we will attribute for that one. So we don't attribute the entire net import like the other two counterfactual approaches. This one has a reference and we only attribute above that reference. So the question is, okay, so for the attributions, obviously you have a cost. It's the greenhouse gas cost for each attribution. And then when you clear the market, you have a marginal cost. What happens with the reference? What do you price the reference? So in the objective function, it doesn't have a cost, but there is a cost that you want to assign for the greenhouse gas regulation area. So one way to calculate this, it's an average emission cost because it's not marginal now. It comes from a counterfactual. You didn't do an attribution for it. So we can calculate an average emission cost for that reference import, okay? as the emission cost of external resources, excluding their greenhouse gas attribution. So whatever was not attributed, this is energy that is produced from external resources that does not have a specific cost. It doesn't have a greenhouse gas bid because it was not attributed, but it does have an emission cost based on the technical characteristics of external resources. So we can calculate an average emission cost of all that energy, and we say, okay, the energy that was imported into the counterfactual, into the greenhouse gas regulation area for the counterfactual reflects this average emission cost of all these resources outside. And we can, as the market operator or the regulator, we can say this cost is borne by the demand in the greenhouse gas regulation area, because it's still an import into that area. So it is regulated for greenhouse gas cost, but it's not charged the marginal greenhouse gas cost. Now, mechanically, when you do the settlement, you're using marginal costs. So what happens here is the market operator, through the energy settlement, as we said before, for supply and demand in the greenhouse gas regulation area, will collect a greenhouse gas revenue that reflects the marginal greenhouse gas cost. However, a portion of that import is priced at a lower average emission cost. So the market operator over collects the greenhouse gas cost, and similar to the loss over collection that we have, which is a similar phenomenon, where when you do the energy settlement, there is a marginal loss component of the LMP. So you collect marginal losses, but the real cost is an average loss. The market operator refunds the difference, which is the loss over collection, to the demand in its balancing authority area. Right? This is a neutrality for the loss component. You have exactly the same phenomenon here, where the market operator will over collect for the greenhouse gas cost, because the settlement is based on marginal costs. However, the reference import is priced at an average, so the difference is an overcollection, and then the market operator will refund that to the demand in the greenhouse gas regulation area, exactly in the same manner that the loss over collection is refunded. So now that we have the entire picture of how this specific counterfactual works compared to the others, we can open up for discussion. And then I have another slide that does a comparison at a high level. But let's answer some questions before we go to that.
First up, we have Callie Wells.
Yes, Callie.
Hey, George, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. Thank you for walking through all of this and then presenting this third idea also for us to think through. A couple questions here, but I'll start off with, I think a higher level question is, part of the GHG attribution and part of the role that I think the counterfactual plays, no matter what formulation you go with here, is really intended to try and make sure that we get appropriate attribution of the resources that are, outside the GHG areas and are serving load inside the GHG areas. So I think as we go through these options and think through the pros and cons of all of them, it'd be really helpful to have that policy conversation or that policy discussion as to what is the appropriate attribution, what is that appropriate counterfactual? Because all of these, as you mentioned, they answer different questions, but that also has, an underlying implicit policy decision in terms of what the appropriate attribution looks like and what should we be comparing it against. So I'm not saying that we need to have that now, but I think as these conversations continue and maybe the next meeting we start really looking at these three options, it'd be really helpful if we can kind of engage in that higher level policy question first, because I think that will help kind of shape some of these conversations in terms of the pros and cons of the options. But that is okay. Yes. So that one aside. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, yes, this is very important because there are many ways to do this, right? And that's one of the points I wanted to make here. you could have many different ways to achieve, including in your solution, an element of cost that reflects the greenhouse gas regulation and how you're going to do it exactly. But it's inherently difficult because the method that you will choose must be immune to passing greenhouse gas cost to external load outside the greenhouse gas regulation areas, because the load should not see, external load should not see greenhouse gas costs. And that makes the whole problem particularly difficult to come up with a very straightforward solution. For example, we're breaking apart here the solution into two pieces. We say we're going to have a counterfactual to isolate the effect of the greenhouse gas cost, and we bring in the IFM, we have attributions, we reference the attributions one way or another to some reference from the greenhouse gas counterfactual. There were even some thoughts that they were floated around. Well, why are you breaking the solution? Why don't you combine the problems together and solve it as one go? Have the optimal counterfactual, include the attributions of the cost on top of that. And the reason we cannot do that, we have to break it apart, is because if we combine these problems, now we will be passing greenhouse gas costs to external demand. So it's not an easy problem to solve, and it has many different ways that you can go about it. So there are many questions and many philosophical answers. It's not more as a policy as also some philosophy that you want to apply to come up to a policy. So yes, there are many discussions at multiple levels that we probably need to have and be comfortable, all of us, with a solution that makes sense. There's no perfect solution here for this problem. Trying to isolate and limit the secondary dispatch is a very difficult process because you cannot even identify the secondary dispatch. You can only estimate an upper bound for it. And we have come up with many different ways to achieve a restriction to the secondary dispatch, and using the counterfactual is one of them, as said. I think it's the most efficient one. We have others. We have introduced many constraints in our market that they also achieve to limit the secondary dispatch. And the more constrained a market becomes, then the higher cost it becomes. So we shouldn't lose also sight of the fact that trying to achieve the secondary objective of reducing the secondary dispatch and reflecting the solution, the greenhouse gas regulation cost, should not sway us too much from the main objective that we have as the market operator, to have an efficient market that gives you an optimal solution with a lower cost. And those two are not perfectly aligned. They go into different directions. So we have to find a solution in between that we're comfortable with. So I agree with you. There's a lot of discussion that we need to do, and also at the philosophical level of what we want to achieve at the end.
Yeah, thank you for all that. Yeah, I think mine was more of, if we're looking at all these different counterfactual approaches, for example, the Vistor one has, the perspective, or it comes with it as saying, okay, the counterfactual is basically, let's dispatch all the resources optimally to serve its own load first. And then from there, if there's excess energy that's dispatched in the IFM to serve another load, that can be attributed, versus the current approach where it says, okay, let's dispatch all the resources optimally in the non-GHG area, and let's let, for example, Clean Resources in Nevada help serve load in another area first before we then attribute it. I was, I guess, narrowly asking about that policy conversation, but you raised a lot of other ones that hopefully we'll think through. But just another quick question on this non-GHG cost counterfactual. So with this approach, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it here. So if you're going to run a counterfactual with no GHG costs at all, then I'm assuming for the resources within GHG regulated areas, you have to separate out their energy and GHG cost offers. So is the CAISO now thinking about going down that that path potentially?
The ISO is not thinking. This is, we're just visiting and presenting different approaches that you can go about a counterfactual. We're not coming here right away suggesting that we should change the approach that we filed and approved by FERC for the counterfactual. But since we are examining other possibilities that we could potentially do as an enhancement later on down this EDAM discovery path, I wanted to point out that there are other ways to go about a counterfactual, and give you another point of reference that you can move in the opposite direction of restricting economic displacement. You can actually open it all up. And yes, this particular no GHG cost counterfactual method will have to either extract the greenhouse gas cost that is embedded in the energy bids of resources inside the greenhouse gas regulation area, or have these resources bid that separately from the rest of the energy bid, as has been suggested before, as a form of increasing transparency to the market, although we still believe that this is not really transparent, since both bids, if we go that way, the greenhouse gas cost bid and the energy bid without greenhouse gas costs, are still proprietary information that we can't publish. So, and the effect again in the solution, it affects the counterfactual because it runs with a lower energy bid without greenhouse gas cost, but it doesn't have an effect on the IFM other than we're calculating an import that we use as a reference. So we may go that way if we want to follow the no GHG cost counterfactual method. It's not what we're proposing at this point. We're just presenting alternatives that we may want to consider in the future.
Okay, fair enough on making the point that, yeah, you guys aren't proposing this at this time, but this would require that separation. I appreciate it. Thanks.
I'm not seeing any other hands raised at the moment, George.
All right, let's go to the next slide. So this is a slide I put together to provide some comparison between the counterfactuals. And I want to start with a caveat here, or a disclaimer, that these are preliminary conclusions that one can draw by simply looking at how these methods work in theory. To really have definitive conclusions, of course, someone has to perform simulations and simulate the performance of these different approaches. So I'm going to start by that. So just by the higher level of examining how this counterfactual works, methods work with the IFM that follows them, I drew some conclusions here. I want to go with you presenting them. You may agree or you may disagree. And my comparison here is based strictly on the mechanics involved. So I take the ISO method as a baseline for comparison. So if we want to evaluate the performance of the counterfactual methods in terms of what is the lower cost in the objective function of the IFM, and I'm not saying that this is the way to compare, it's one way. As I said earlier, here we're weighing two different objectives. The primary objective was of lowering the cost, and the secondary objective of reflecting the cost of greenhouse gas regulation while trying to reduce the secondary dispatch. So these objectives are not aligned. So looking at the IFM objective function value at the end may not give you a proper basis for comparison. But if we want to look at that and say, okay, that reflects the ultimate cost that IFM reaches, how do we rank the methods? If we use the ISO method as a baseline comparison, the Vistra method should arrive at a lower cost. And I say should again, because this is just looking outside of, at a high level, how the methods expect to perform. For a definitive outcome, you really need to have to do simulations. So why is it lower? Why it should be lower? Because it allows a higher volume of greenhouse gas attribution. Why is that? Because it doesn't allow economic displacement outside the greenhouse gas regulation area in the counterfactual between BAAs outside. So it reserves volume that would have been cleared the counterfactual. It reserves this volume to be attributed in IFM. So you can have a higher level of greenhouse gas attributions, which means a higher volume of economic displacement between external resources and internal resources. That economic displacement means internal resources that are more expensive are displaced, so you have a lower cost, at least for serving the internal load. So the outcome of this theoretical analysis would say the cost should be lower with the Vistra method, and I think that Vistra has demonstrated with examples that this is possible. If we go to the non-GHG cost method, we expect even lower cost if you look at the objective function, because you start already with a reference import, which is priced ex post. It doesn't have a cost. It doesn't affect the objective function cost. And then you may have additional attribution that happens on top of that, but this is a lower volume of the attributions you will have. So some of the cost is already outside of the objective function. So if you're looking only at the objective function cost, yes, you may find that you even have even lower cost with the non-GHG method. Now, if we go to the second line here, what can we say about secondary dispatch? Again, looking at the ISO method, taking it as a baseline for comparison, going to the Vistra method, because it has a higher volume of greenhouse gas attributions for the method we said earlier, capacity is reserved from being scheduled in the counterfactual because there's no economic displacement allowed between balancing authority areas. Higher volume of greenhouse gas attribution translates to expected higher volume for secondary dispatch. And if you go to the non-GHG cost method, the inverse happens. You have a lower volume of GHG attribution because you only attribute above a reference import that clears your counterfactual. Lower greenhouse gas attribution volume, you expect to have lower volume for secondary dispatch. If you go for the settlement and say, let's compare how the settlement works out. In the ISO method, we have the GHG attribution payment to external resources at the marginal GHG cost. In the Vistra method, it's exactly the same. You may have different volume of attributions, so that may result in a different greenhouse gas cost, but the settlement mechanism is the same. However, the settlement mechanism is very different for the non-GHG cost method, because the GHG attribution is at the marginal GHG cost, but its attribution is only above the reference. And the reference is priced at a lower average emission cost, ex post, and then any difference collected for that reference is refunded back to the load. So there's a different mechanism for the cost. So if we now look at the effect of that mechanism to the load, again, taking the ISO method as a baseline, and if we want to find what's the impact to load within the greenhouse gas regulation areas, the Vistra method will give you a lower cost for the load inside because you have a higher volume of attributions potentially, so more economic displacement. more volume to economically displace more expensive resources inside, so you expect a lower cost for the load inside. If you go to the no greenhouse gas cost method, you expect an even lower cost because some portion of the import is not even attributed, and it's priced at an average emission cost. On the margin, only the portion of the import above the reference carries a value and a cost. So if you break this apart, with the effect of the uplift, or we return the difference for the reference import, then you have a lower cost overall. And if you look at the impact for load outside the greenhouse gas regulation area, again taking the ISO as a baseline for comparison. Now, with the Vistra method, because you limit economic displacement at the counterfactual, and then you reserve more volume for attributions in the IFM, you expect to have more backfilling for load outside at a higher cost because you take now attributions to displace cost in the greenhouse gas regulation areas. So potentially the cost for external load may be higher. If you go to the no GHG cost method, again, you expect a lower cost overall now because you slice a portion of the solution and it's not priced on the margin. It's priced on an average emission cost. So that brings the cost for the load overall, both inside and outside. Now, again, this is just my observation and theoretical analysis of how the counterfactual works with the IFM. For definitive analysis, again, I'm admitting a disclaimer here. We cannot draw definitive conclusions about how these methods perform unless we actually simulate them and find exactly what is the outcome. So I open up for discussions, and let's hear if there are agreements or disagreements. My point of view here, it's an open discussion.
Not currently seeing any hands raised at the moment. Just a reminder to everyone, if you're having trouble raising your hand, you can always type in your question in the chat. So yeah, I'm not seeing any hands raised, George.
I realize this potentially third counterfactual methodology is very new to all of you, and you probably need more time to think about it and think about its ramifications and its effects. So it's natural not to have questions at this point, but if questions come into your mind later on, just send us an email and
George,
we'll try to address them.
We did
Yes.
actually just get a hand raised from Callie.
Absolutely.
Hey, George, it's Callie Wells with WPTF again. Actually, along those lines, I know it takes a lot of work to put together actual simulations in a full solver, but is there any way you guys could put together some Excel examples that show how all of this would work so we can start kind of thinking through those details and maybe come with more questions next meeting?
Of course, and I'm embarrassed to say that I wanted to make some examples to present. I just didn't find the time to do it. These examples are very complicated, as you have seen before, examples that we presented with how the counterfactual interplays with the solution. You need to have multiple PAAs, multiple resources, multiple areas potentially. So I had the intention to prepare examples, I just didn't have the time to. So let's leave it with me saying that I owe you an example, and I'll try to make one.
Thank you. I appreciate it. You mean you don't have unlimited time these days?
Yeah, it's a little bit scarce.
Thanks.
I'm not seeing any other hands raised, George.
Okay, that's the end of my section of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Isabella for next steps.
Great. Thanks, Christina, and thanks, George. So for next steps, we will be posting a comments template to the GHG Coordination Initiative webpage. So comments will be due on today's working group discussion by end of day November 26th through the ISO's commenting tool. So you'll be able to go into the template and submit comments anytime between now and the 26th. And then for our next working group meetings, we're looking at Friday, December 20th for our next one, and then into 2025, looking at the week of February 10th. So that's a forward look at our next 2 working group sessions. And then can we go to the next slide? And then this slide just has a couple links for references. So if you would like to present at an upcoming working group, you can do so by requesting to present through an email sent to isostakeholderaffairs@CAISO.com. And then for relevant information related to the GHG Coordination Initiative, there's a link out to the GHG Coordination Working Group webpage. So with that, I will turn things over to Christina, because I believe she has a slide to share with us as well. Thank you all for your participation today.
Thanks, Isabella. I just have a quick announcement for insights into the ISO grid and market operations. Be on the lookout for our Energy Matters blog. Here you can see our latest blog post. And with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining today's discussion. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. The video file will be posted on the initiative webpage. We thank you very much, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.